Hey, hello, sir. Hey, thanks for coming. All right, thanks everyone for coming, and I can see a few familiar faces and some unfamiliar faces, so it's always good to see some other students from different majors. Last time we had, I think, equal translation majors and non-translation majors, so it's always good to get English students and Chinese students and other majors to sit in, because I think translation is a life skill. It's something that you can use in any career. So even though today we'll be talking more about the translation side of things, I still think that a lot of this will apply to any major, whether it's tourism or management or whatever. So yeah, thanks for coming, guys. So today, you can have a look at the topic I put up here, okay? So what we're looking at today is the translation process, okay, translation process. Now, in translation studies, we often make a distinction between the product and the process, right? So product is what you see on the page, right? Like a published paper or a book or a translation project, and a process is what actually, what's in the translator's head, okay? And I think the translation teachers here will agree that we don't really talk about the process that often, especially when it's happening, in real time. So tonight is quite a special lecture because I'll be using a couple of videos of my own translating, and I'll be giving commentary based on the process that I'm using, okay? So to start off, what I might do is give you a little image, because I like to use imagery in my presentations. So I want to start off with this, okay? So what do you think this is?
Your
Any
mind.
ideas? Huh?
Your mind.
My mind?
We need to.
I mean, literally, what is it literally?
A cabinet?
It's a cabinet, okay? We'll start with the literal meaning first, okay? So literally, this is a cabinet, right? 橱柜嘛, it's a cabinet. And imagine that you are a teacher and your job is to teach people how to make a cabinet. Now, I don't know, like in China, you don't, well, yeah, you do have this, but in the West, it's a really important and complicated process of making a cabinet. Now, imagine if you're the teacher and you have to explain to students how to make that cabinet. What are you going to do? Well, imagine if the teacher just said to you, here you go, look at this beautiful, amazing cabinet, copy it. Okay? What if they said to you, just copy it, right? Just like in China we have shanzhai. Just imagine if you duplicate this cabinet just like that, right? But this is exactly what happens in a lot of translation classes, is they give you this beautiful cabinet or a beautiful translation, and they expect you just by looking at it to know how to make it. But actually the processes that are involved are pretty complicated, okay? So I want you to think about that in the back of your mind. And again, imagine you're the teacher, right? So what are you going to do? If you've got your beautiful cabinet, your students aren't happy because they have no idea how to make a cabinet, so maybe you'll give them some raw materials, right? You'll give them some wood and some basic stuff like glue and hammer and stuff like that. That's what we do in translation class sometimes as well. We give students things like grammar and things like vocabulary and beautiful, fancy 装逼词汇, right? Really to show off, We give them lots of fancy things like tools and materials, and they're good, but there's a limitation there. So I want you to think about what that could be. So if you're the teacher, you're giving them lots of wood, lots of random materials, maybe that's not enough. Now, what would the teacher do instead of the materials? Well, maybe they'll give you this, right? Maybe they'll give you a diagram with lots of complicated terms and numbers and weird like arrows and stuff, right? They might do that and maybe it helps you, right? In translation class, we often give fancy theories to students and expect them to know how to translate well, right? So the reason I'm giving these images is to show you the traditional way of teaching translation, which is we give you a beautiful translation that I did, it's mine, I'm very proud of it, and then I want you to copy it. That's the traditional way. And then we give you lots of vocab, and we give you lots of theory, but the focus is always on the finished product and not on the process. So that's what I want you to think about with tonight's lecture. And also, think about anyone doing interpreting students, there should be quite a few in the class today. With interpreting, we don't do that, right? With interpreting, we don't usually give you a lot of theory, and we don't usually give you a perfect interpretation and then expect you to copy it, right? We almost never do that because we know that interpreting is a practical skill, right? You have to know the process. So we teach you note-taking, and we teach you memory and stuff like that. But with written translation, we don't do that, right? With written translation, we very rarely look at the process. So this is something that I think we could work more on in teaching students, okay? All right, so first I want to talk about another problem which I think most Chinese translators are familiar with, which is that a lot of the theories that we teach in translation school are very much based on Western languages, on European languages, right? And I use this example, in English we say, it's like comparing apples and oranges, right? So it's like, it's a crazy comparison. Do you think the problems that Europeans have with European languages, do you think they're the same as the problems that we face with Chinese and English? Anyone who speaks Chinese and English will tell you you're crazy, okay? Our problems are much bigger than their problems. So I think the problem is that a lot of these theories, they're quite biased towards Western and European languages. And they also give a lot of examples which are French and Italian and Spanish, etc. So for Chinese students, I think you guys probably are thinking, it's not very relevant to what I'm doing with Chinese and English. So this is something we have to work on. Also, of course, something else that we should acknowledge is that Chinese and English have almost no relationship with each other. So one is Sino-Tibetan, which is the language family in East Asia, and then the other one is Indo-European. So they developed completely independently. So the chances of one-to-one equivalence are quite low. So again, we really need to acknowledge that if we're going to improve our translation methods. And I just wanted to also give you another thing to think about before we look at the process involved. This one is, foreigners in China probably have been called alien from time to time. Alien, I think in America alien is used to describe foreigners, I think. Sometimes?
Or you mean extraterrestrial alien?
Well, yeah, that's the question, isn't it? So, the reason I'm using this example, I'm not talking about Chinglish, by the way, although Chinglish is a really interesting topic and I will talk about it in the future. And I would like to write a book on it one day because I think it's really cool, interesting, and I have a lot of examples in my teaching. But that's really not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is that C to E, Chinese to English, if you think about it, it's one of the biggest industries in the world for translating. I mean, the number of projects are huge, and that's only going to get bigger and bigger as China becomes stronger and more economically powerful. So this is going to present us with a lot of issues. We have to decide what are the best methods? What are the best methods for translating? If you look at the situation in Europe, right? The translation schools in Europe, they have a long history. So they have lots of pre-established practices and standards. We don't really have that with Chinese and English. Maybe English and Chinese is not too bad, but for Chinese to English, we don't really have a lot of standards to look at. So this is something we need to keep working on. And of course, Chinese is a very important language. It's an official language of the United Nations, and as we know, there are, 1.2 billion Chinese speakers, so it is a massive, massive language. But the amount of research that we have is very limited. All right, so now I'll talk a little bit about the method that I'm proposing. Okay, this is the method translating only into English from Chinese. Okay. So, firstly, just a few pieces of information. So, firstly, My method is just one method, okay? There are many other methods. Mine is not the only method, and mine is not the best method, okay? With translation methods, I believe that you should just follow whatever method works for you, right? This is just my, my suggestion. It's also a very basic method, because I think when it comes to methods, I wouldn't recommend you make it too complicated. I mean, translation is already very complicated. If you add a complicated theory, it just makes it really difficult to work out. So my method is relatively basic, and it's also targeted at beginning students. So most of you here that do translation, this is quite relevant for you. And also, remember I said that translation is a life skill. So even if you're not doing translation as a major, you can still use this in your work. As long as you have foreigners or you're involved with international friends, these methods are going to be useful for you. Also, I wrote here that this method is mainly for non-literary text. What does that mean? So literary text means like poems and novels and plays and stuff like that. So my method is really not relevant to that, okay? With like literature, that's really complicated, and my method is not really about that. My method is for non-literary texts. So that accounts for about 98% of projects. I mean, I just made that figure up. That's not scientific, but yeah, it's quite rare to do literary translation because, it's a very difficult industry to get into. So this method is mainly for non-literary texts. And yeah, and also like this method is based on my own experience doing community translation in Australia. So my experience mainly is in legal, immigration, and what else? Commercial text, so business, like legal contracts and stuff like that. So my experience is quite limited. It's a very limited, very narrow view. And if you talk to other teachers, they'll have different suggestions. Mine is just based on my own experience. Lastly, I hope that this method can be a starting point. It's not the end of the story. You guys, I hope that you can contribute and you can make your own method to make your translating more efficient and more productive. Okay, so that's just some information about the method. And before we move on, I just want to explain something about this. Have you guys seen this triangle before? It's quite famous, I guess. Has anyone done like project management? This comes up a lot in project management. So it's, well anyway, I think it's famous. So what we say is, if you're managing a project, quite often you say to the client, okay, client, Mr. Client or Mrs. Client, I can ensure that my project is timely. I can ensure that it's high quality. So I can ensure two sides of the triangle, but I can't ensure that it's going to be cheap, right? So that's the general situation with projects is you can only achieve like two sides of the triangle in most cases. So either it's going to be quick and cheap, but the quality isn't very good, right? Or it's going to be high quality, cheap, but it's going to take a long time, right? So usually you only achieve two sides. So this is kind of like a reality. It's just because of the way it is. But I thought about this triangle and how I can apply it to translation studies, and I came up with my own triangle here. So you can have a look at this one. So what I've done is I've replaced the three sides. So you can see accuracy, fluency, and timeliness. If I think about the three most important things that you should achieve as a translator, that's basically the three most important things. So yeah, obviously like accuracy means that you haven't changed the meaning, that the basic message is the same. Fluency means that it reads smoothly, it reads like a native speaker text. And timeliness is about, did you meet the deadline? Which I can tell you is one of the most irritating parts of being a translator, is the deadlines involved. So anyway, my hope is that this method will help you to realize at least two sides and maybe a third side if you're doing well. We'll see how we go. My focus today is on the accuracy and fluency side. Okay, that's what I'll be looking at in the process. All right, let's move on then. So again, just some basic principles about this method that I'm proposing. Firstly, my process is an acknowledgement that there is very little common ground between Chinese and English, right? There's very, very little. And so I think if you don't acknowledge that, if you take it for granted that, I don't know, translating 和谐社会 as harmonious society is going to be a lovely translation, then I think, yeah, you're going to have trouble with native speakers of English. So, yeah, I think my process is really about acknowledging that, yes, there are really big differences and we have to work on that during the process. And I'll explain more about that later. Secondly is that I think good teachers of translation in China, they should acknowledge these differences and we should teach them specifically. I think we should give specific examples of what are the differences between Chinese and non-Chinese culture and how that affects the way people think and the way people express themselves. And lastly, yeah, in my mind, I don't think a good translator can do a good job without an understanding of this. All right, let's move on. Okay, so yeah, just introduce my method. It's very, very simple. So there are 3 stages to the method, and I don't know if this works for translating to Chinese, but I imagine it's a similar process. So there are 3 parts of the process: reading, rendering, and revising. So they happen to all start with R, so I'm very, very happy. It sounds very cool, but oh, I just realized it all says 1. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, that should be 1, 2, 3. So yeah, they're the 3 parts of the process, and I'll explain exactly, what I do in those 3 parts. Again, let me just reiterate that this is my own method, and I'm not saying it's the best method, it's just one way to approach it. If you find it useful, you can use it. If you don't, that's fine as well. But I think it doesn't matter, who you are or what student or what you're studying, you should have your own method. If you don't have any method at all, I think it takes a long time to finish your translation. You really got to have some kind of method. All right, so let's have a look at the first part of the method. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's a lot of text. It's difficult to put a picture on this, so just have a little read before we move on. Okay, so the reading part is when it's the comprehension part. It's when you need to understand the text. Now, you guys are mostly Chinese, so for you, the comprehension won't be much of an issue in most cases. If it's your second language, obviously it's going to be a bit more difficult. With the reading part, try to understand everything, every term and every concept, and you may need to ask native speakers or experts. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about this because I did mention a few days ago in class that networking is really, really important as a translator. Because as a translator, you can't know everything. Even though they want you to know everything, it's impossible to know everything. And so as a translator, for me personally, I have, a friend who's good at mathematics, because I'm terrible at mathematics. I have a friend who's good at finance. I have a friend who's good at classical Chinese, or a friend who's good at medicine, or legal, or whatever. So I have these people that I can talk to and get accurate information for the translations I do. Now, I know a lot of you are pretty young, maybe you don't know that many professionals, but as you get older, I really recommend that you meet as many people as you can and keep in contact with them because they'll help you a lot. I don't know how I could translate without, my experts, my friends who can help me. So you will need to consult with some people to understand some tricky concepts. And remember, this is not just about language proficiency, this is a translation problem. It's not a problem of language proficiency. So, you guys, when I gave you the Chinese texts, a lot of Chinese people didn't even understand the Chinese. So a lot of the time it's not about your language level, it's actually a translation problem. So you should always talk to a professional if you can do that. If you can't, of course, you can use other ways. You can use Google, you can use Baidu, you can use different search engines or databases to find out exactly what the problem is and how you can solve it. All right? So that's the reading part. And then also with the reading part, there's another part which is called chunking. See the last word on the page? Chunks, chunking. So chunking means that you take the text and you start to break it down into small parts. So for me, psychologically, I find it really helpful because as a foreigner, looking at a big wall of Chinese is a little bit intimidating. So for me, I like to break it down into small parts so I don't freak out too much. And also for you, I mean, even though it's your first language, it's still a good way to organize the translation. So try to separate it into paragraphs if possible, or smaller paragraphs. Okay, so that's the reading part. We'll have a look at the next stage. So have a look at that. Okay, so the next part is the rendering stage. Rendering. So rendering doesn't really mean translating, it's a little bit different. Rendering means that you take every unit in the original text and you translate it literally. So it's a literal rendering, a literal translation. And I put in brackets every 字 and 词. Well, if you know Chinese, you know that there are two units in Chinese, 字 and 词. So you make sure every single character is accounted for in the literal translation that you do. Now, a lot of beginning students, they don't do that. They actually translate in a very, airy way, just like, bouncing around the text. I'll take this, I'll take that. And that's okay, but there's a risk that you'll miss something. And in Chinese, I mean, one character can make a really big difference. So with the rendering part of the process, you can ensure that everything in the text is accounted for and you don't miss anything. Also, you can see the second point. I said, I only make idiomatic shifts if they come automatically. What that means is idiomatic 地道嘛. So idiomatic means, does it sound natural, right? Is it natural? Shift means you change the structure of the sentence, or you change the 词性, the part of speech, right? You change like a noun, go to a verb go to an adjective, whatever. So you only do that if it's automatic. This is quite important. If you try to be too creative at this stage, you're going to waste a lot of time. Right? This is the crux of this method. This method is good because it's quick. It's quick. So you start with a literal rendering, but you only make shifts if they're automatic. So later on, I'll show you an example. And then the last one was try to maintain the original sentence structure and even the grammar, which I know obviously like Chinese and English have really big differences, but that's okay. Just start with a literal rendering, get all of the 字 and all of the 词 on the page, and then you can start moving on to the next part. So that is the literal rendering part of the translation process. And then the third part, which is revising. Okay. So just have a look there, revising, which is also called checking. Checking is another term for it. So with the revising part, a lot of students don't even do this. I mean, it drives me crazy. They hand in their homework and they haven't even checked anything. Revising is essential. You have to do it. And even if you don't do a literal rendering, you should still revise. It doesn't matter what method you're using, the revising part has to be done. So with the revising part, there's a few things that you should be doing. Firstly is grammar, right? So if you're translating literally, obviously the Chinese is different, and so there are going to be grammatical problems, right? So you should fix the grammar issues first. Secondly, you need to make changes according to sentence structure and word order, right? So I'll give you a very simple example. So newspapers, right? Newspaper articles in English, the first paragraph is always the most important information. It's usually the most newsworthy item. So I don't know, if someone died, for example, they'd put the death in the first sentence, right? And then every paragraph in English will be least important. It'll be in the order of importance. In Chinese, though, newspapers, they tend to be a little bit more like a story. They tend to have like a 铺垫. They kind of give you the background first, and then they go into the detail. So according to English norms, 就是 你看到 SL norms, right? 规范嘛. So according to the norms, you should make some changes depending on what the text is. This will become clearer when I show you an example later. So yeah, you make changes in sentence structure. Of course, that includes word order, 语序嘛. So in Chinese, for example, the time always goes at the beginning. In English, you usually put it towards the end. Also, in English, you tend to go directly to the point first, and then you give the background information. In Chinese, you tend to have lots of 铺垫 first, and then you go to the point. So again, in this stage, you should be changing sentence structures and word orders when you need to, when it's possible. The last thing is, very, very important, is you need to make decisions. This is the key decision part. You need to make decisions on those difficult units that you don't know how to translate. So that includes like technical terms and also like understanding certain parts of the text. So that part also needs to be dealt with in the rereading. So yeah, that is the process. It's very simple, just 3 steps. But I think the benefit of it, which I'll explain, I think it's the next one, yeah, explain the benefits as well. So the benefits, there are 3 main benefits. The first one is, with my process, is that firstly, it streamlines it, okay? Streamline means that it makes it more efficient. It's more productive. It's quicker. It's a quicker process. Why? Because in this process, you deal with the simpler stuff first. So in the literal rendering part, you do all the basic stuff first. Like, you know, he went to the bank or whatever, just really basic sentence structures. You do all of that first. That groundwork is already done. You don't have to worry about it. It's already typed out and it's done. Okay? So that means that you have you work faster and then you have time to deal with the more difficult parts later. Some students, they read the text and then they find difficult words and get freaked out and then spend a lot of time worrying about them and then they waste a lot of time. So I think it's good to do the groundwork first with literal translation and then move on to the difficult parts later. Secondly is that it deals with the problem of fatigue, okay? 疲劳, fatigue. So fatigue is a really big problem. If you've done professional translation, you know that it's exhausting. I mean, basically, you're crazy by the end of it. And so, you know, if you can work faster and not, you know, be too tired, that's a really good thing. So any process which helps you work faster is a good process. So how do you prevent fatigue? Well, the good thing about this process is you're separating the accuracy part and the fluency part. They're dealt with in separately. So for example, the accuracy part, I'm talking about the literal translation, right? So that is the focus on the source text. You're focusing on the Chinese, every single 字 and 词. You're focusing on that. Then in the revising part, you're focusing on a very different thing. You're focusing on English, right? And if you think about it, I mean, they're very different processes, right? It's like your brain needs to have a switch. You're kind of switching from Chinese to English. If you're doing written translation, if you're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, it can be quite exhausting. Whereas if you like divide it up and go, I'm doing Chinese now, and then, oh, I'm doing English now, it's a good way to prevent, you know, getting too tired. So that's the benefit about minimizing fatigue. The last thing is, obviously, mistranslation can be prevented if you are doing a literal rendering at the beginning. That way you don't miss anything, or you don't misunderstand something. Also, this is quite important with sentence structure as well, which I'll talk about later. So there are some of the benefits for this method of translating. We'll have a look now at the way that I'm going to present this method. So remember, the focus today is not on the product, it's on the steps involved in translating. How do you present that, right? What kind of method could you use to present that? Well, one method is using a method called TAP, which some of you probably know that. TAP is quite famous for us, for some crazy translating people. It is quite famous. So TAP, has anyone heard of it before? No? Okay. Well, you're lucky because this is a really interesting thing. So TAP is a special way to conduct research about different activities. So it's not just translating. You can use it for translating, but you can also use it for many other things. So I'll give you an example here. 出生思维法 is the Chinese word. So this is a cartoon, obviously, and at the bottom it says, "Hey, come on, this isn't brain surgery." Sorry, it's a stupid joke, but I wanted to show this as an example. So imagine that you're a surgeon and you are performing surgery on someone's brain, and you want to teach someone how to do it. Well, how do you do it? One way is to explain the process as you're doing it. This is called verbalization. Verbalization means you talk, you speak. So imagine you're the doctor. You would say, "Hello, I'm the doctor. Today I am performing a brain surgery. Here is my knife. I am picking up the knife. And now I am cutting open this guy's head, and now I'm taking out the brain. It's great." And then, so TAP means that you explain the process as you're doing it. So originally it was used in psychology, actually. They were using it there, but in translation studies we use it a lot as well. So TAP is a really interesting instrument to understand translation process, but unfortunately it's not that common. I mean, it's not commonly used in training, it's more commonly used in theory, but I think we can start to use it more in class as well. Now today's TAP is very, very simple TAP. It's not sophisticated at all. But if you're interested, we could do more TAP in class later on. So before I just move on to the videos, I want to explain a couple of caveats about TAP. Caveat means danger or risk. It means risk. Yes, I want to use a cool Latin word to show off. So, so just a couple of caveats. So firstly, TAP is not perfect. It is not a perfect tool, because if you think about it, if you're doing a process and you're talking about it, you can only talk about stuff that you're conscious about, right? There's no way that you could talk about something that you're not conscious of. Like unconscious processes, you can't access that. So that's the downside of TAP. A lot of things we do, we don't think about it, right? We don't talk about it, so it's very difficult to access that. So that's one of the key criticisms about this type of this tool. The second thing is today's TAP is very simple, and I didn't choose like professional level text. So the text that I chose are like really simple, like Chinese text. I did this for 3 reasons. Firstly is, it is very difficult to present professional level translating to an audience. It's very hard because you guys don't know the text, you don't know the background, you don't know the client. It's just very, very hard to communicate professional level translating to an audience. Secondly, most translations are confidential, so I feel bad. I wouldn't really be able to present it to you. And thirdly, like not everyone here is a translation major, so it could be a little bit too, tricky to understand. So that's just some caveats about the TAP process before we get started. Right, so that's just a little presentation about it, and now we will launch into the videos. There are 2 videos. I'm hoping that, because I think the 2 videos will take half an hour each, but I don't know what time is it now. Probably it's already been half an hour, I guess. We'll see how we go. Yeah, we'll see. I don't want to go on too long because you'll probably start yelling at me. So
just go until they kick us out.
We could, go until they kick us out. That could work. And I'll also be commenting on the video at the same time, which is really good. I can actually cut myself off. It's awesome. Yes, there I am. How do I can't use Windows. How do I make it full screen? I do. Okay, so what I did is I used like a screen capture software. So I used that to create a video, and then, so it shows you the workstation that I use. So I guess I'll let myself speak, so you can, he or me, I can explain to you what's involved. Applications to check different dictionaries. So this one, I've installed. I'm going to go back. That's the text there. So it's a very simple text. It's just as an exercise. Although you might have to translate something like that in real life. I mean, it is pretty practical text. Okay. Okay, so before I get started with the first text, I think I should probably just introduce a little bit about my workstation here. So, can you hear that okay? Should I turn it up?
Turn it up.
Turn it up? Maybe I should turn it up. There are many different ways to do it. This is just the way I do it. You don't have to do it this way. But I found it helpful to have one separate program that I can put the source text in. For example, Wenlin, because Wenlin is a really good text editor. It has a lot of functions and it has a pretty good Chinese dictionary as well, although I don't rely too much on it because it has limitations. So that's Wenlin, and the good thing about Wenlin as well is that it's very stable, so you don't have the problems you have with like Microsoft Word and stuff like that. You can just edit very easily. Yeah, so I'm just talking about the workstation here. So on the left is just a normal text editor. It's called Wenlin. You don't have to use Wenlin. I just use it because it has a dictionary. And then on the right, I'll talk about the dictionaries that I use. You can copy and paste like formatted text, so it's much easier to edit certain tricky documents. Do you know what I mean? So a lot of translation projects, the formatting is very complicated. So quite often you have to take the text and then remove the formatting. So a text editor allows you to do that. That's one of the benefits of using a text editor, not Microsoft Word. Not Microsoft Word. So I use Wenlin as a kind of document editor. And then later on, if I want to export it, I can use like Word or Excel or whatever. So that's my main like text editing software. And then on the other side, I have dictionaries. So I use Mac, and Mac has a app called Dictionary, and it's quite convenient because you can like add lots of different dictionaries at once. So you don't have to use like multiple applications to... Yeah, so this one is like for Mac, you have a dictionary app, which is called Dictionary, and it's free, and it includes lots and lots of dictionaries. That's really good if you have Mac. If you have Windows, I can't help you, I'm sorry. But you can find your own tools if, I don't know. I'm sure there are tools for Windows. So. That's not the only dictionary tool that I have. I have three or four different ones. This one is the Mac one, I have one for my phone, and I'll talk about it next lecture, it's too complicated to check different dictionaries. So this one, I've installed Chinese, English, and then Chinese, English, and also English, Chinese. So it has most of the dictionaries I would use, excluding the online dictionaries. So yes, online dictionaries, of course, we'll talk about later. I'll see if I can just go to the start of the translation. Okay, the funny thing is, this is the first time that I've ever presented translation process. And, of course, I mistranslate the first word. So this, yep, you'll see. So this is incredibly embarrassing, by the way. So anyway, whatever, let's have a look. So there's nothing I have to check. Well, I say that now, maybe later I have to check, but just generally it seems okay. So if there are no technical terms, I can usually start translating now. So I'll start with the first part. Yep, I mistranslated it. You can laugh at teacher,
Teacher.
I'm so dumb.
What should it be?
Well, it's not lightning, I'll tell you that much. You'll find out in a moment. So yeah, so you can see with the TAP, the beauty of the TAP is it's recorded, and then I can also comment on it as it's playing. So you can see your flight, what did I write originally? Your flight has already. I think, did I write already? Maybe I did, but anyway, I think I wrote already originally. Already in English is not usually translated like from Beijing, we don't usually translate it, okay? Because in English we have tense. Right, we have 现在完成时嘛, so you don't need to translate already. Like 已婚嘛, I am married 就可以了. You go for I am already married, 对吧? So yeah. So what I'm doing here is I'm doing a literal rendering. So I'm starting off with just translating every 字 and every 词 literally. Yeah. So I'll just I don't want to keep you here all night. It could go a long time. I'll just explain. So I get up to this part, 冷窝这个词. So let's see how I deal with a word that I don't know. Translating, I'm going to guess something. I usually write it in capital letters. Sometimes I put the pinyin in capital letters, so I might write 冷窝全部. I might write like that, or I might just like put my guess. So my guess is it refers to cold front, but I don't know. I have to confirm that later. So the beauty of translating into English is we have capital letters. This is really good. You can't do that with Chinese. So with difficult words you're not sure about, my advice is just translate it. Even if you don't know what it is, put the pinyin or put the guess, and then put it in capitals. And then you can go back to it later. It's the quickest way, trust me, it's much quicker. If you like stop there and start thinking about it and researching, it just, you lose the whole process and then you get confused. So just keep going through it, keep literally translating. So, I mean, I could confirm it now, but I think that's, it'll like stop the translation process halfway. Yeah, so I'll just keep going. Right. Just, yeah. Bala, bala, bala. So I'm just giving a literal translation. That's where we add a more. So this one here, 据了解, this is an example of an automatic shift, right? I didn't translate literally. Literally would be according to understanding. But my intuition is like, that's just too literal, so I automatically translate it as according to reports. But only do that if it's quick, if it's automatic. If it's not automatic, don't do it. You have to translate, just keep translating. The automatic translation, and that's fine. You can definitely do that. As long as you're not spending too much time on it. If it's a really quick reaction, so literally, 据了解. Yeah, I just talked about that. This is really good. I can just pause myself. So I just keep translating literally. This is a guess, I'm guessing, for that part there. But it doesn't matter, I keep going. 这个可以讲就是外战，对吧? So this part here, somewhere, 外战. So again, we're looking at a technical term. I'm not sure what it is, so let's have a look at the process involved. And then my second option is to use 有道. So, 有道, yes, we should talk about 有道. This is very controversial. Okay? 有道 is the most popular app for Chinese speakers who are learning English. 有道 has immense potential and immense danger. So you should be very careful. Also, there are different types of 有道. This 有道 is a good one because this one includes lots of databases. But if you use like the basic 有道 is really bad. Don't use the basic one. I don't know how to get it. You have to look for it yourself. You use this version of 有道. So with 有道, you should take it with a grain of salt. In other words, be careful with it because the English, yeah, it varies a lot. So always be careful. And look, every reference you have to be careful. But with 有道, be especially careful. It is not perfect. There are many problems with 有道 in terms of Chinglish and stuff like that. But because English is my first language, I'm not very worried about it. I can usually use it like, relatively safely. So I'll try 外战. So according to 有道, 外战 can mean outstation. I don't know what outstation means. I don't know. So this happens quite often. The Chinese word is common, but the English word is not common. So in that case, you need to double check the English. Yeah, this happens a lot. So Chinese words often are commonly used, but then in English, the expression is not common. So the example I gave the other day was 法律效力, right? Which literally is like legal effect or legal validity or legal force. We don't really have that in English. So I'll show you the correct way to double check a translation. So I take the English word and then I check it in the English dictionary. And that way I can double check and see if the meaning is like... Yes, this is a very important part of the process. It doesn't matter what your first language is, you always double check the word in a monolingual resource. What does that mean? It means a resource that is not translated. Okay? So for example, English dictionary, Chinese dictionary, Wikipedia, 百科, etc. All of the encyclopedias, they're the ones you always double check the right meaning. So, according to 英英词典, the Oxford Dictionary, it means a branch of an organization. Yes, use Oxford, man, it's great. It's really, really good. Try to use more Oxford. Situated at some distance from its headquarters. So in this case, I'm not 100% convinced that it's the correct translation. So in this case, I'll use 拼音大写 to kind of keep a note so I can come back to it later if I can think of a better translation or I have more information or do more research or whatever. So then I continue with the 及外站天气 continue with the rest of the literal rendering. Literal intuition. That's Sounds great. This is fantastic. There's lightning, which is 闪电. Yes. I figured out my mistranslation. That's good. So this happens all the time, okay? I'm not a weirdo. All translators go through this process, okay? It's just they don't want to admit it, okay? That's the thing. Translation teachers do not want to admit they make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The key thing is, are you checking it? Are you making sure that it's a good quality? That's the key thing. Yeah, you can see that I mistranslated 打雷. I translated it as lightning, which is 闪电. 打雷 is thunder. I'm not good at weather stuff, sorry. Now this is still a literal translation, so if I'm translating for a client, for example, if this is for the social media account of Keppel Airport, I have to think about the text type norm. The text type norm in English would be like similar texts done for social media. So what I'm talking about here is the text type norm, 文本类型规范, which means, again, remember I talked about the newspaper? In English, newspapers have a certain habit, a certain way of writing. It's the same with this text. This text is an announcement. So you have to think about what is the typical way of translating or using English for an English announcement. Like in a headline for social media, like we wouldn't say like thunder, your flight may have been cancelled. Like it's a bit strange. But we could add something. So this part needs to be changed. So I think a warning. I'm going through this one, and then I think I come up with two different translations. Yes, two different translations here. Flight cancellations at Keppel Airport due to thunder. Thunder at Keppel Airport, your flight may have been cancelled. So they're both not very good, but that's life. You can't always get a great translation.
Go with the first one.
We'll see. I can't remember which one I chose. Yes. Flight cancellations at Keppel Airport due to thunder. Thunder at Keppel Airport, your flight may have been cancelled. They're both okay, I think. Maybe I'll try this one first. Yay! The second one was very dramatic, so it's a bit too dramatic. Exclamation point there. So that's one thing. When you're doing a literal rendering, you can use exclamation points or brackets to give you a note so you know when to go back to it. To tell myself I need to go back to it later. Okay, so I'm continuing. This is again to remind you, this is the revising part. So I'm checking the quality. I'm maintaining a high level of accuracy and fluency with the translation. This one here, I'm having trouble with 冷窝. You can see I'm going crazy, trying to find, what is this bloody 冷窝?
Angry.
Oh, yeah, you'd be angry too. Like, it's embarrassing. I'm losing face right now. So okay, so what's happened here is that the Chinese used a word which may not exist or it's not common. So in this case, I would use Baidu to check. So firstly, when I use so if it was English, you'd use Google, right? Don't forget the other ones; they're not good. Use Google and use the search engine bar and type in the letters.
Baidu, I search pinyin first to see if it's a common term. Searching in pinyin tells you if it's common or not. This one is 老挝.
See?
Ah. So searching with pinyin, you can see it looks like it's actually a misspelling. It's a typo. 应该是这个窝. Ah. Okay, interesting.
Yep, welcome to the real world. This always happens with translating. Honestly, I think every project I've ever translated had a misspelling. It drives me crazy. So, if it's your first language, it's much easier because you can probably guess the spelling. If it's not your first language, you're going to have more trouble. This is totally normal. Don't worry about it, but you have to check.
Oh, hey, interesting. Oh dear.
Copy is important, very important.
This text is not a professional text, but trust me, it happens almost every translation project.
Yeah, I just said that. Okay. Moving on.
Okay, double check.
Oh, okay, so this is the double checking part, okay? Very important. Never trust anything. As a translator, you have to be very paranoid. Every resource has flaws, including Yordao, right? So Yordao gave two translations. One was Eddie, I think. The other one was Vortex. I'm checking exactly what it is. Don't check in a bilingual, check in a monolingual reference.
Very important double checking, otherwise you can't verify if it's the correct term.
Verify.
I think Yordao was wrong. So I should check.
Wikipedia, of course.
It's not in Wikipedia, which is not a good sign. If it's not there, it usually means it's not common. I know there should be Vortex. Obviously, Vortex is relatively common. And I can do a search for cold. So cold, the word cold is not on the Wikipedia.
You see what I'm doing? So when you get the page, that's a starting point. Then you do a search on the page with a keyword from the text. That way you can double check if it's a real thing. Wikipedia is pretty broad, so if it's not on Wikipedia, it's probably not common. That's the basic understanding.
Page. So again, it's not a good sign. So cold Vortex might be incorrect. Cold Eddy. Cold Eddy might be a better option.
So I'm checking Eddie now.
Nope. What about Eddie by itself? Eddie, and then search for cold. Cold Eddie. Da da da. I found it on Wikipedia, so it exists. But only one usage in the whole page.
It's better than nothing. If one usage is better than nothing, it means that it exists.
So that tells you that it's not common. So I can double check cold front. I'll double check cold front.
So again, I'm testing the hypothesis because my original hypothesis was cold front. I'm checking what that is in Chinese.
Cold front. Let's see if there's any
You guys know about the language option on Wikipedia? On the left, it has the languages. You can choose Zhongwen. You can't enter it because it's blocked. But you can hover over it and it has the Chinese written on the what's that called? Cursor you'll see.
Chinese.
See? So if you hover over Zhongwen, it has the name of the page in Chinese.
冷风是吧？冷风。冷风。
冷风。So
冷风啊。
That's cold front. So I'm double checking the hypothesis I
So
had.
that's cold front. 冷风 is cold front. So that's not the same as 冷窝. So it looks like it should be cold eddy.
Yeah. So that just proves that when you're translating, you can't take anything for granted. Even if you guess it, in many cases you will have to check it actually.
Which is a technical term, but there's not much you can do really. I mean,
okay, we'll just keep going with that one as well. So I'm continuing the revising process. I'm changing parts of the text. In particular, I'm focusing on word order, right? For example, in Chinese, time goes at the beginning. In English, I'm changing the word order, so the time goes at the end. I'm just changing that part there. You can see I'm also changing, this is a text type norm. 看到了吗? 11 p.m., this is norm. 就是规范而已嘛. It's a norm. In English, we don't usually use 24-hour unless it's like army situation or something. Yeah, so that's text type norm. So just keep changing, making changes on that one. Thunderstorm, because I mistranslated the first word. And then I keep going, I make changes, more changes. I change tense, right? 就是完成时嘛, right? 那个 perfect tense, 对吧? Perfect tense is a very, very important part of translating into English. Very, very common. So make sure that you can deal with it accurately for that one. So I'm making changes here. Bala bala, go away. So I'm making more changes there. In English, we can't have repetition. We have to avoid repetition, so the two reports, they have to be changed. I'm getting rid of that. Just omit it. So that's an example of omission. 省略嘛. Omission should only be used if you have a good reason. For example, text type norm, or because the message has already been expressed. You don't need to translate it literally. Also, just to remind you that formatting of dates is important. In Australia, this is the correct formatting. 21 June. In America, I think it's June, is it 21st? Yeah. So in America, it's swapped around. Okay. In Australia, we don't put TH. We don't put TH. We just put 21 June. Yeah. It's a small thing, but it's important. And by the way, your client will tell you if they want it for British people or American or Australian. You should ask and make sure that you're maintaining the same variety through your translation. Also note formatting of text type norm. In English, we put a comma 3 units into the number, if you know what I mean. Like 1,000, you put 1 comma. Small thing, but it's important. So, bala bala, keep going.
Focus everything.
Leave that one.
I'm guessing 外站 means 其他的机场.
Just guessing, I don't know. Do you know what it is?
不是吧？应该是其他的这个 weather stations， 对吧？
So again, I'm checking the hypothesis. So again, I'm very desperate at this point. I have to use your die. I must be very desperate. So, bala bala, bala bala, bala bala, bala bala, bala bala. I think that's other stations was my translation. I don't know if that's correct. That's just my draft. Okay. And so yeah, that's basically.
Of course, one last thing.
That's basically the end there. That's the end of the first video, and just to give you a demonstration of how the process works. And again, with the literal translation, it's just a hypothesis. When you get to the third part, then you start to test the hypothesis. All right. So I've got one more video before we finish tonight, and it's another example to show you. So this one is another text. Again, it's a very simple text.
Okay, so now I'm going to read the text in front of me as part of the first part of my translation method, reading.
So yeah, I'm reading the text. It's my second language, so obviously I will have to check some words if possible. So bala bala bala, reading and bala 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 bala. Okay, now I get to, this is the rendering part of the translation. So here I'm not confident in my terminology, so I put it in capital letters.
So in this case, I'm not sure.
Bala bala, aquatic plant. You can see I maintained the punctuation. You should do that in the literal rendering. Keep the original structure, and you can change it later. Okay, very very important. Because sometimes if you change it, you might forget the structure, and then you might change it accidentally. So it's really, really important to maintain the original structure at the beginning.
Willowy, cute.
可爱。
With an aesthetic feeling. 茎叶 stem.
Again, this is kind of a technical word or
stems and leaves.
specific word.
I'm not sure.
I'm doing a literal translation. I'm using capital letters. Bala bala. Keep going with that. What's that one? Oh, this bloody Chongyu drives me crazy. So, Chongyu. So yeah, I'm freaking out at this point.
I have another set of dictionaries.
So I'm checking the third set of dictionaries. And would you believe it's another bloody typo comes up again? Yeah.
I have so many dictionaries.
Did you guys pick it up, the typo?
This is my third.
Bala bala, so I go crazy. What am I going to do? I keep searching. And then I find it. I find it in Baiku, right?
References.
So looking up is very important.
Is that it's pure, it's not affected by translation.
So what I'm talking about here, again, just to remind you, always use monolingual references. Chinese, Chinese, English, English, not translated.
By a second language.
I talk about it as like it's not corrupted, it's more innocent. That's the way I describe it.
Which it should be a relatively accurate explanation.
So I think here I check a number of sources. I think. So I check a number of sources. So again, the beauty of this app is you can combine different dictionaries together. So I'll show you, there are two different English and two different Chinese.
Oh. So here I have a few different dictionaries. So I have a couple of 中中，这个是大陆的中中，然后这个是台湾的中中，然后有两个汉英，这个和这个。So I usually check all of them. I mean, they're not perfect. You just have to compare them and see which one is the most satisfactory. So with 成语, there's always a literal meaning, like penetrate deeply into the heart. That's usually, they give you a literal translation and they'll give you the extended meaning. Gladden the heart, refresh the mind. Refreshing, I guess. Put people at ease. Sometimes the example sentence is useful.
So in this case, with 成语, sometimes you have like 2 or 3 versions of the translation. You should put them together, put it together in your literal rendering. And then later, you can decide on which one you prefer.
Refreshing.
So I put them together here. Refreshing / put at ease. And then I can check it later. So again,
fragrance.
Bala bala, fragrance, bala bala.
Both food stuffs.
This is a really annoying one. This is 就是食物中的佳品. So you can see I'm going crazy.
Okay, so food products. 从遥远的古代 from antiquity.
So yeah, I chose one here. I wasn't really happy because food stuff is a pretty old-fashioned word, but anyway, whatever.
Yeah. So again, this is not a literal translation, but it's an automatic translation. So if I can translate it idiomatically, with almost no thinking, then I do that.
So what I'm talking about here is, this is an automatic shift, okay? So I didn't translate literally like, from far away, ancient times, right? So because in my mind I have the term, because I studied history, I know antiquity is like a common word. If you're good at finance, maybe you translate automatically from finance. If you're good at mathematics, you translate automatically from mathematics. It depends on what your expertise is. So for me, antiquity is automatic, but for other people it won't be automatic, and that's fine. If it's not automatic, don't worry, just put a literal translation first and come back to it later.
If I can't do that immediately, I just
bala bala,
so activated.
也包括这个
So you've got to keep a high level of
那个啥大
register.
我国各地是吧
That's
another
been
automatic translation.
Has been wide.
However, you can see here, this is also automatic, has been 对吧时态嘛 So this present perfect tense, that's automatic because it's my first language, I can do it that way. But for some students, it's not possible. So for you guys, maybe the tense is wrong in the second part. But in the third part, I'm hoping that you will fix it. You better fix it, okay? It drives me crazy sometimes.
Being cultivated.
So bala bala, so keep going. Oh, this bloody one. Oh,
看一下，经历
this one will drive me crazy.
No. Gentle. Mild. Oh.
Okay. I'm not happy at this stage.
的色调 I don't know. I'll come back to this one later.
Yeah.
从古至今
Yeah, so again, I'm using the method of literal rendering first, using pinyin as a kind of way to remind me to come back to it later. So bala bala, I'm dealing with that.
engraving.
Bala bala, yeah, literal rendering, Yong. I was trying to deal with yong. A little bit tricky to translate.
Sometimes
You can see quite often the example sentence can be useful. So they use the word ode, which is not a bad translation in that case.
the example sentences can be quite useful.
Bala bala, bala bala, bala bala, bala bala.
Positive virtues.
Just making a few changes. It's still literal, but just making a few automatic shifts.
So that's the end of the literal rendering. So that's done. I can then move on to the third part, which is the revising. So I need to make sure.
So you know, obviously this is not finished, right? This is the second part. There's even like spelling mistakes. That's okay. You're going to fix it in the third part of the process.
Or that it conforms with English-speaking norms.
So now I start with the heading.
The charms of lotus, or
标题嘛
the use of lotus in Chinese culture, maybe. The allure of the lotus. The allure of the lotus plant.
Coffee is very important to help stimulate the brain.
The
Yeah.
lotus in Chinese culture. 这个还行. So I know it's very different to the original, but you're translating for an English audience, so their expectations are very different to it.
So this refers to I added something. This is an addition. Addition is also a method used in translating. In the Chinese, there is no Chinese culture, but from the perspective of the readership, they should know, you know, what the topic of the article is.
Chinese readers' expectations. Allure here translates.
还有一点是 logic, right? For example, the Chinese says like lotus culture, right? So from an English perspective, logically, like lotus can't really be a culture, it's a plant. So, yeah. So you often have to, when you're translating into English, you have to analyze the logical relationship between the different words and make sure that it makes sense in English. That relies on your yugan, your intuitive sense for the language.
Maybe, and although I didn't say that there is lotus culture, I use the word Chinese culture to make it a bit more foreignized.
Yeah, that's called foreignization, when you add a foreign element to the translation to create that exotic effect.
So it's an okay translation. It also has a kind of...
I'm very happy with myself at this point. I'm like, yes! Finally!
Prosody. 有音律.
这个 prosody 对音律啊音律 prosody refers to the rhythm of the language. So different languages have different rhythms. So English has a very different rhythm to Chinese. And so if you can maintain like a nice, you know, pleasing sound in the language, that's a bonus. So I'm very happy with myself at this point.
Prosody. The allure of the lotus. It's got that prosody to it. And
The allure of the lotus, got that, yeah, you know what I mean. I'll shut up.
Okay, so now I fix the grammar, the idiomatic expression, all that stuff.
So now moving on to the hypothesis of this word, 水生植物. I'm testing the hypothesis.
水生植物.
So blah blah, I'm checking it. So Wikipedia, I should always double check. So you start with the 词条, with the header, with the page,
是可以的.
and then you go down to the 中文,
中文,
and then you check. Oh wow, there it is.
Yes, oh yeah. So yeah, sometimes you just take a guess, but you need to double check because you really don't want to make a mistake.
Yeah, so translators often have to be very cautious. 这个没办法.
The lotus is a kind of very popular aquatic plant.
So I'm making some changes here to the idiomatic expression. 地道表达方式. With, I talked about this the other day, with is a very important word in translation. It allows you to connect different ideas together. In the Chinese, there is no with. It has punctuation instead. So with, you have to start using with more often. So bala bala, keep going. I don't know why I prefer species. I can't justify that, but it's just, I think it sounds better. Sorry.
Cute, aesthetically pleasing. 可爱的.
So cute, obviously cute is way too casual, okay? It's not going to help you with this text.
With withering, pretty, withering, pretty 还行.
No, 不是还行, 不行. I disagree with myself now.
So this is a method of using synonyms.
Okay, so now I'm using a thesaurus. You know what a thesaurus is? Yeah, 就是同义词词典, 近义词词典.
So you check using a thesaurus, 同义词词典.
So Apple has a thesaurus, so it's really quite helpful. I don't know about Windows, you have to find it yourself.
So we check the 同义词词典. Attractive, okay, good.
So you can see attractive is a really simple word. I didn't think of it. So that's really normal. If you're really tired, you're not going to think of everything.
Pleasing. Attractive should be okay, I think.
If it's a thesaurus in your second language, you have to be very careful because probably most of these words you don't know how to use them. So just be really careful with thesaurus.
Attractive is relatively formal. 这个 stems, 我拼错了 but anyway. Stems. 这个问题是今夜这个
Yeah, so this one here, yeah, it's stupid, but well, you know the problem in Chinese, you know, two characters can be ambiguous, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I'll leave that. I deal with that later. I make a guess. My guess is that it is stem leaf, but I'm not sure. I'll leave a punctuation mark here. Then I move on. I keep going. This part here. I have to make a decision. Make a decision about which version I'm going to choose.
Now, if you're not a native speaker, then you can't be very confident, but
yeah, so if you're not a native speaker, you have to check or you have to test. You have to test your translation. Check it in Google. It's very simple. Open Google and type in the word and then see if the collocation appears. If it doesn't appear, it's probably not common.
You can always check Google, type in the...
Bala bala, okay. This one, food stuff, I hate this translation.
Food stuff is a little bit old-fashioned. There might be a better word. Old-fashioned.
Bala bala, I talk about that for a while, have some coffee, keep going. Bala bala, I look up lotus in Wikipedia.
Then I need to look for food or eat.
就是那个食物中的佳品, that part there, I'm trying to deal with that part of the translation. The problem is the Chinese part 佳品 has to be translated, you can't leave it out.
Here we go, it is eaten. It is eaten.
So in this case, it's not very helpful. Parallel texts, they have limitations. Sometimes you can get really good stuff, other times you just can't. You just have to try your luck. So, 没办法, just keep going. Keep going, 加油.
Buttons.
Yeah. Bala bala. More coffee. 就是那个什么清丽柔和的色调 the 废话 is just dripping.
Keyword is 色调, I guess. There might be a better explanation. 表现思想感情. Sentiment 还行.
Sentiment.
对, sentiment has given it poetic sentiment, I guess.
Okay, so in this case, this is a situation where it's really desperate. You do not have equivalence in terms of terms, you don't have equivalence in terms of collocation, you don't have equivalence in terms of culture, you have nothing to work with, okay? Welcome to Chinese English translation. It's fantastic. So in this case, my translation was very free. It was a semantic, I guess, a semantic translation. And I know you'll criticize me because a lot of people, they don't like free translation, but anyway. However, in this situation, a parallel text should help you. If you're clever, you can use a parallel text to check the acceptability. So what do? I go back to Wikipedia. I go back to Wikipedia, and I check Lotus again, and I have a look at the different chapters of the page.
Or symbolic, so it's a very common way to do it.
And there's one chapter talking about cultural significance. I'm taking that part of the Wikipedia page, I'm using it in the translation revision. So it's valued all over China for its cultural significance. Yes, it is a free translation, it is not word for word, and the message is slightly changed, that's correct. But if you have a better version, feel free to submit it to me.
So that's my reference translation from it. And
then I
engravings and paintings.
Keep making a few changes towards the end as well. For example, 很多. 很多 is an important word actually. It's a very simple word, but in English, in a formal text, many is not used very often. So you guys should know the structure I talked about in class, like a significant amount of, an enormous number of, like that structure, a great deal of, those structures are quite important. So I just make some changes there for that one. And then also one thing I'll mention, this one here, 这个句型, using, what is that called? Whatever it's called. When you add a 动名词, when you add a gerund to describe a sentence, that's a very common structure in translation. You need to start using it more in order to connect the two ideas together. You can see the Chinese here, right? 赋予品质, this part here, are using a 动名词 to connect them together. I don't know the technical term, you have to look it up.
Repetition.
So I think that's
one my friend later.
So yeah, that's just a very basic TAP to describe the process to you. And the next step is for you to have a try. So next time you do a translation exercise, think about if you can separate the literal rendering and the idiomatic rephrasing. See if you can do that at home, and I look forward to seeing your attempts in class next week, hopefully. So thanks guys, thanks for coming, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.